I am going to talk a little bit about the very exciting topic of conditions of participation from CMS. I know you're all super excited to hear about that. Um, but actually, um, the regulations are set up in a way that kind of support the whole system so that it works, so that we have these opportunities, so that we can actually get from potential to life-saving transplant. And so regulatory structures don't always seem like they'd be dynamic and interesting to think about, but a lot of effort has been put into the frameworks behind our system and the conditions of participation included to ensure that we have the structures needed to really make this system the one that it is. And this system is complicated. So this is a subway map, but it's not a subway. It's actually showing the patient experience, which is the light blue line running through. The SRTR, which is the scientific registry, uh, they hold a contract with HHS at the national level to look at transplant outcomes and all the data that comes from the transplant field. And they put together this map about a year ago to just show how many stops along the way there are for the patient's experience, but also how much collaboration is required for this to work. And I think it's an awesome graphic to just show the complexities, really, of how donation and transplantation happens. And so the donor hospital piece is the orange, sort of light orange at the top. The OPO is the sort of bright red there. And then you can see sort of all the various places where it has to come together and intersect, like Grand Central Station to make sure that we're actually delivering for the donating public and also for the patients that are in need. So how does CMS kind of go about touching on some of these points to make sure that the responsibilities are clear, that where we can ensure that each of the players and stakeholders are collaborating in a way that will maximize success for the utilization, well, again, for the patients who are waiting and the utilization of the organs that may be available for transplant. And before I get into some of the CMS regulations, this was already mentioned a little bit by Brian, but in 2022, the National Academy of Science put out a report, and it was extremely comprehensive. And in it, it was looking at how we can better realize as a system the promise um, and of equity in organ transplantation. And it really was a roadmap, to use the same analogy as the subway there, but it was a roadmap for all of the stakeholders in its collaboration. And one of its first recommendations has to do with how donor hospitals can ensure that they're maximizing their performance together with OPO collaborators in ensuring that we're identifying every potential opportunity, referring every potential opportunity, maintaining every potential opportunity so that we can realize every organ donor possible. So, some of this is because, as it turns out, the total number of deaths, when we look at this, and there's been a number of studies that have been published on this data, is very large, the total number of deaths annually. But when you look at then in-hospital deaths, which is the pool of potential donors, because those would be individuals who die in a manner where organ donation is going to be preserved as an opportunity, so on a ventilator, it's already coned down quite a bit. And then if you take even just a very rough cut of medical suitability, it brings you to about 2%. And that has changed. We used to say 1%, and we've been able to expand that pool of what we would consider a medical opportunity for organ donation. Some of that's been through medical innovation, like, for example, treatment and potential cure of hepatitis. So, years ago, not even that many years ago, hepatitis would have been a rule out. right, for organ donation as an opportunity, because if the donor had hepatitis, that would be transmissible to the recipient and would be deadly. And so that would have been an immediate rule out. So there are medical innovations that have changed over time what we consider the opportunity or the pool, medical pool of suitability for potential organ donors. But we say generally that it's about 2%. And so that's really quite small, which means that our at-bat opportunities are minimal. And we really want to make sure, and the system wants to make sure from a regulatory perspective, that each one is identified, referred, and maintained, while all the other appropriate steps for additional screening and then, of course, authorization and everything else is completed. So what does that look like from a regulatory perspective? A whole lot of text is what it looks like. It's a lot of regulation. I'm pretty sure what you're looking at is, yeah, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is something, you know, us attorneys love to read, and hopefully you won't have to read too often. But basically what it's setting up is that there is an entire section in the regulations related to the importance of organ donation, to the responsibilities for hospitals. And this has been the case for decades. Specifically, and like I really can't see this at all, so I'm going to move up a little bit here. There we go. This is much better. The hospital conditions of participation include this referral obligation, which you guys all have just heard all about. And it's right in the regulation, that the OPO, the referral has to happen, the OPO has to do the screening, and also that the approach of the family needs to be by a trained individual. These have changed over time, so that as the system has learned what's effective, the regulations have then been revised and reflect then the better practices to ensure that we're continuing to improve how we're approaching organ donation and transplantation. So the conditions of participation also include this regulation that potential donors must be maintained. And this is really important because once the referral has happened, then there's a period of time where that assessment is going to take place, and the OPO is going to do additional screening and testing, et cetera, whether there's an opportunity to place the organs or tissues. And so it's critically important that the hospital partners maintain, for example, the ventilator support during that time period. And that's actually a regulatory requirement. And if that wasn't enough, it's also in the interpretive guidelines. So if you haven't stopped to think about kind of the layers of regulation and how this all works, you have sort of the Code of Federal Regulation, then CMS promulgates its specific regs that are enabled, and then CMS often does these interpretive guidelines, which help kind of flesh out the regulations themselves, provide a little bit more detail on what CMS expects, so that when they come and they do their unannounced survey, you have at least some sense of what they're looking for. And again, in the interpretive guidelines, the expectation that there'll be referrals and maintenance of donors by the hospital in collaboration with their OPO. So that's federal regulation. And we also have state law. And you've heard a little bit about the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. I'm going to talk a lot more about it later this afternoon. But in the UAGA, again, this requirement that during this period of time where there's an assessment by the OPO to see if organ donation is clinically an opportunity, also during the time period that the donor registry is being checked, maybe the family is being approached for discussions, that all measures necessary to maintain that suitability are maintained. And essentially, again, talking primarily about the ventilator, but also things like ensuring blood pressure is maintained and stability in general is maintained, so that you're not getting all the way to this part of the process and then thwarting the opportunity for organ donation. Sometimes I'm asked whether there's some sort of ethical conflict in sort of maintaining potential organ donors at this point in the process. And it could be, you know, the patient's already been declared deceased by neurologic criteria, the patient's brain dead. but support is being maintained when we're not sure yet whether organ donation is going to move forward. And what I'd like to point out is that conflict of interest, at least from my legal perspective, technically, is when there are two competing interests where the possibility of benefiting one interest could influence the course of action leading to potential harm of the other interest. So in unpacking that, you have to have two interests, right? That's the first question. Are there two interests? Well, I think in these cases, there are two interests. There's the interest of the patient, and there's the interest of potential organ recipients if there might be an organ donation. So there are two interests. And then the second question is, could the possibility of benefiting one interest influence the course of action leading to potential harm to the other interest? And I think this is really where I see more confluence than conflict, because continued critical care provided to patients in these circumstances really serves those multiple interests, consistently. That providing maximum critical care to the patient at that time is consistent and not in conflict. It doesn't have potential harm for that patient, but it does have potential benefit if an organ donation is going to move forward, especially in a case where the patient, him or herself, registered, and this is their wish and intent to become a donor. And so that's really important to keep in mind, that in those instances, then actually it is in the interest of that deceased patient. So donor management and treating the patient might be two separate goals, but the interests are congruent rather than in conflict is the way that I think you can consider the ethical analysis. So all of this to say is that a lot of effort has been put into the system to align the law, the ethics, policy, and practice so that when we're in real time, and these circumstances, as you know, happen in critically short periods of time where we all need to know exactly what we're doing and to make sure that it happens and that we're not missing opportunities. What you're looking at here is an honor walk, which I am guessing some of you may have had the privilege of participating in. I know I've been to some and they're incredibly moving. But I think it's also a really nice visual of that alignment that we need as practitioners in this field to know that the law and the regulations and the policies really are all lined up to encourage and ensure that organ donation and every possible opportunity is realized whenever possible.